Chris Hensley is a registered representative of Cambridge Investment Research, Inc., a broker-dealer member of FINRA SIPC. Investment advisor representative of Cambridge Investment Research Advisors, Inc., a registered investment advisor. Cambridge and Houston First Financial Group are not affiliated.
The Houston Midtown chapter of the Society for Financial Awareness presents Money Matters with your host, Christopher Hensley.
Good morning, everybody. You're listening to Money Matters Radio on KPFT Houston, is what I'm so used to saying every morning at 11 a.m. on Friday. However, we are still in quarantine or lockdown here in Houston, and so we are recording today from my middle bedroom of my house, and we are going to put this on YouTube. We're going to add a video version of this, so that's something new that we're doing this month while we're here, and then we have the podcast as well. Our guest today is Jen Gumbel, who is patiently waiting for us. Jen, we always do just a quick kind of calendar or monologue.
Yeah.
But for listeners, the industry surrounding estate planning focuses on documents, and our society, when it thinks of legacy, focuses on wealth. But estate planning is more than a document, and a legacy more than money. People with wills can have significant assets transfer in ways that didn't plan, and people who have trust can also leave assets that require probate proceeding to transfer. Those are two facts that shock most people. Having the right documents that do what you want them to do is incredibly important, but it's not the only thing. Financial organization is just as important. So our guest today is Jen Gumbel, who again, patiently waiting for us.
Definitely.
We will do kind of a deep dive into this topic. Now, you have a blog and podcast as well called An Organized Afterlife. So we'll give everybody information on how to find out more about this. So we'll just do a quick little rundown on the calendar. Since we are in a special situation here, there's not much to it.
Usually, it's a very short calendar.
Yeah. So usually in April, we have Houston Money Week. And so Houston Money Week 2020 is basically on pause. Now, there are some of the organizations that have participated in that. It is free financial education workshops to really everybody in the Houston and the Gulf Coast area. And that's what we're known for, is these presentations where we go out and we do workshops. However, we've had to pivot because those workshops involve more than 3 people. And so just kind of where we're at on that. Most of those events have been put on pause. However, I know Houston Women's Resource Center last week, Jenny Guzman, who is one of the leadership team members, has hosted some of those online. And so we're trying to get as many of the nonprofits, for-profits, community banks doing community reinvestment work on board to do the online education events. So we'll give you information on that as that rolls out. We do always encourage people to go to HoustonMoneyWeek.org, and the United Way, where we usually host most of our meetings for Houston Money Week, has the 411 line. So if it's resources that you're looking at right now on financial education, you can always call the 411 line, and they'll put you in touch with one of the nonprofit partners that might be able to assist. So that's kind of where we're at with Houston Money Week. I know you've been hearing me talk about it each and every month, and so we will be back in full swing next year, but that's where we're at as well. Now, for Money Matters, for the podcast next week, we will have Mike Michalowicz. I hope I'm saying that correctly. He is the author of the book Profit First. He has in Pumpkin Plan. He has a new book that just came out called Fix This Next, Make the Vital Change That Will Level Up Your Business. So he will be joining us next week. And with that, let us go ahead and get Jen. So usually get Jen on the line, but you're already here. So So Jen, let's just kind of go ahead and get a start here. You are an estate planning probate attorney in Minnesota. What can you
Yes.
tell us about yourself to share with listeners so that we can get to know you a little bit better?
Yeah, well, I'm an estate planning attorney and probate attorney. And I've been doing that for over 10 years. And I also really hate death. I have a little bit of a background in it. I lost my dad when I was a teenager to cancer. And what I see in this industry is how much death really causes chaos in a lot of areas, including the legal area. And there's so much that you can do to minimize those legal issues so that, because ultimately, who has to deal with it? It's someone who's grieving you. And it's, if you leave a mess that they have to deal with, it's just another thing on top of all the other things they have to work through. So doing an estate plan and doing it, kind of viewing it in what I think is the correct way, can really help minimize what's on their plate. And that's the whole point.
So this is a fantastic topic. I know as a financial advisor, one of the things that people tend to procrastinate the most on,
yes,
even after we make recommendations that you need to, at a minimum, have XYZ legal documents, much less a legacy plan, but even just the legal documents, it's one of those things that people have resistance to, and they procrastinate on actually getting it done. Your podcast is called An Organized Afterlife. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I started the podcast and the website in general because I think there's a ton of information online, but a lot of it is not very accessible or understandable. There's a lot of information you can find about estate taxes, which doesn't really affect many people. I'm in one of the worst tax states, and we still don't have many people who are running into that problem. But there's very little information, for example, on what is a probate. And I have a lot of people that I meet with who have a lot of misconceptions just because there isn't great information that's out there. So what I try to do on my website and on my podcast is just give little bite-sized pieces of information of the basics. And so people can have that basic understanding that will help equip them work with professionals to get a good plan in place.
So I know so the basics are super important. I mean, often people won't even approach this topic. There's that anxiety,
yes.
that uncomfortableness there. How do you
all
start
of our
that?
weirdness with death kind of comes out in this area?
Absolutely. People, I don't want to discuss that, knock on wood.
Right.
How do you approach that conversation just to get it started, to get people headed in that direction?
Yeah, well, I think the important thing to know is two things. Doing your estate plan, it's not a morbid thing, and it doesn't increase your odds of death. Your odds of death is 100%. And lawyers, we're trained to never give percentages, and that's the one percentage I'll give. You're going to die at some point, and making preparations for it doesn't mean that you're a morbid person. It doesn't mean that you're bringing it on yourself. It just means that you care about the people who are going to have to pick up the pieces when you go. So
I love that. I love that. One of the things you mentioned earlier is that people who don't do this, what they're leaving behind is a mess for those who are grieving. And you mentioned something about financial organization, and I'm on your website in Organized Afterlife. I'm looking at that. You've got checklists and that sort of thing. How important is financial organization?
Oh, it's incredibly important. So what I started to see as I've been practicing in this area is I would run into people who left an incredibly manageable. I mean, there's a to-do list. There will be things you have to do, but it was incredibly manageable. And usually it would be a widow or a widower who had kind of learned in the school of hard knocks how important the organizational piece was. And so they would come up with a plan, usually with an attorney, have very good documents written by an attorney. And these would be people that would run the gamut of very complicated situations and very simple, straightforward situations. But they would take those steps that we're used to hearing about, but then they just knew, because they had been through it, how important it was to know, number one, what did they have? What accounts did they have? Where did they bank? What life insurance policies did they have in place? And they knew where it would go when they died. And some of these things will have, life insurance is the primary example, will almost always have a beneficiary listed. And the insurance agent will ask you, where do you want this check written out to? And the people who left a manageable list would know, because they had been through it, that had to be coordinated with their plan. And that's the big piece that gets missed a lot in my industry. And frankly, we don't do a very good job as estate planning lawyers to talk about that financial coordination of it. We don't talk about that enough. And when I work with the families who had people who were financially organized, it is just a night and day difference of what needs to be done. It's really, what could have been messy is something very manageable.
I love that. I mean, I would just piggyback on that and validate it, that financial organization is super important. I mean, when I have clients walk into the office, there'll be some people that will walk in with a crate with file folders and Excel spreadsheets, and they know exactly where everything's at. I'll have clients that will walk in with their statements that are still sealed. They have not opened their statements, and they're not going to open their statements until they they'll be real honest with me and say, Chris, I threw that up on the nightstand and haven't been able to look at it. And so they'll bring it in that way. And so it is very different as a professional to see people who are organized in this way. And you talked about, some of these widows and widowers who have gone through the school of hard knocks, that they kind of knew. One of the first things that you said is a basic thing is, what do they have? Kind of taking that inventory of looking at it, and then where will it go when they die? And so knowing that up front, those are some important things that you just said that you're sharing with listeners there. Do you have a story that you might be able to share with us of a client or someone that maybe didn't do the right things when it comes to estate planning?
Well, with lawyers, we're Vegas, so whatever happens stays with us. But I can explain kind of a composite of issues that I've run into, and it's really common for any lawyer dealing with probates. We run into we run into things like insurance policies that list a beneficiary that's an ex-wife or an ex-husband, because they knew that they had it, and other people were able, because after you die, how do people know that you have these things, right? And so there's somehow people find out that this insurance policy was out there, and then they contact the agent, and the agent gives them a name that they're a little surprised to hear. So that's one thing. Another thing, I practice in Austin, Minnesota, and we're the corporate headquarters of Hormel, which is a great company. A lot of people work for them, and a lot of people who have worked for them for a number of years had their bonuses on paper stock certificates. And that's another thing that when I work with clients who have paper stock certificates, a really easy organizational component is to say, let's register these electronically, because then we can find them. It's very easy for us to find, instead of hoping we're looking in every drawer and finding every piece of paper that corresponds to your monetary rights with this company. And then that electronic registration also gives us the option, if it makes sense with our plan, to get an automatic transfer to people that we don't get with that paper stuff.
Oh, I love that. I wish I could share that with all my clients. And I'm just the idea, going down the rabbit trail of old physical stock certs that could be worthless. You don't know.
Right. You don't know if they're worth something. You don't know if they're worth a ton.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So the idea of part of your organization of getting those electronically registered just having the idea of the valuation of them when you do that, whether it's even
Hmm.
worth the time to mess with it and do the
Yep.
research, is super important. And then also you mentioned the right at the beginning, the idea that when you pass away, if you have an old insurance plan or even an old retirement plan that had the ex-spouse on it, you want to find out about that on the front end
Hmm.
before you pass away. That's the worst time. I'm sure the ex-spouse doesn't mind, but that's
Right.
the worst time if that's not your wishes there. So I think
Right.
that one of the general things that we could say is a beneficiary designation checkups to make sure that you're reflecting what your wishes are. That's
Hmm.
huge. So I'm going to pivot for just a moment because I'm looking at the website here and some of the topics that you've covered in the
Hmm.
past there. What can you share with parents about estate planning? How important is it for parents to do estate
Oh, it's so important. And really anymore, parents are the people who have the complicated plans. And they have the complicated issues because our tax situation has gotten so much better and affected so many fewer people. The common misconception is I have a simple estate because I'm not wealthy, or no one feels like they're wealthy.
planning?
And people tend to picture kind of Downton Abbey to be when you need to start thinking about an estate plan. Uh, but when you think of the legal issues that come up when you die, if you die when your kids are small, you're going to have very complicated legal issues to deal with, and very important ones, which is who are going to be the adults that, number one, parent the kids, and number two, manage your assets for their benefit. Because it's hard to have automatic transfers to kids. You probably shouldn't be doing that. We don't want to have a life insurance check written out to a 6-year-old. So having as part of your plan a method for an adult to manage assets for those kids' benefits is super important. And quite frankly, those are the complicated estates that I deal with, is parent of small children or not.
Wow. So I was shaking my head when you said Downtown Abbey because my experience has been that nobody thinks they're wealthy. Even the most wealthy clients that I have, they'll come in
Exactly.
jeans and blue jeans and a t-shirt, and they're very good savers. It's fiscally conservative, but they
Yes.
still think, so yeah, that's a common personality trait that I see there. Some of the things that you mentioned there is that, if you have that idea that, oh, I'm not wealthy, I don't have an estate, I don't need to do that. But if you're a parent, these custody issues, these guardianship issues, if you were to pass away, if you don't have something in writing, ultimately the decision is going to come down to a judge. And so
Hmm.
taking those steps to make those decisions up front, and that's just the guardianship part of it. The asset part of it, the idea of leaving a big chunk of money behind for a 6-year-old is,
Yeah.
as you use as your example, those decisions need to be made up front so that we don't have problems when it comes to that. So let's go back to the what you call an organized afterlife. What are some steps or some tips that you can give to somebody to do an efficient approach to their estate planning?
Hmm. So the first thing that you can do this weekend is to just understand what you have and start to gather some of that information. And I have a checklist on my website that you can download that can help guide you through that. Because some things that it's easy to forget about, things like your discharge papers if you were in the military, because there can be benefits, things like headstones. If you qualify for disability payments from the military, your spouse may be able to continue those. And discharge papers are just the ticket that opens the door to someone else trying to get those benefits after you're gone. So um, things like that. The real estate that you own, if you have a copy of the deed, that's the best thing you can have. But you're starting to gather this stuff to understand what you have. And then when you meet with a professional to say, okay, what should my plan look like? Because everyone's plan is going to be a little bit different depending on what they have and the people involved in the state you're in. Um, but when you go in to get that plan figured out and then the documents to help support that plan, you can also ask questions about your financial organization. Are my deeds listed properly? A big thing is with spouses that the plan is the surviving spouse should be owning everything with no strings attached, no rules that they're following. If that's the plan, your deeds need to show that. In my state, we have to have 2 words to make that spouse become the sole owner of the property. If we don't have those 2 words, then we have to do that through a probate process to get it to them, which is a very much no fun probate process. Not because my state probates aren't bad, but it's no fun to have to do anything when 2 words could have avoided it. So,
Absolutely.
so those are all important pieces.
So I am just shaking my head yes here on the idea of using a professional for this. I've changed my thinking completely on this. I'm extremely frugal, so I used to be a big fan and proponent of kind of the do-it-yourself or kind of the online estate planning, but when it comes down to some of the things you just mentioned, the idea of having 2 words that will make you not have to go through a long, lengthy process and going through a long, lengthy process, it is super important. The more complex that things get, to bring in a professional to make sure you're doing it correctly. You mentioned, that's for your state. If people have property or real estate that's outside of the state that they currently live in, that's a different situation. If you have stuff outside of the United States, that's a different situation.
Yep.
So as the levels of complexities grow, it's super important to tap a professional to bring them on board to make sure what you think you have is what you actually have. And then they change it up on us when they change the law, and so you want to revisit it, review, make sure that it's still applicable. So I want to pivot once again, because I'm a big advocate for legacy planning. So I know when we focus on estate planning and we talk about the physical assets, but it looks like we're kind of on the same page here. What can you share with us about legacy planning?
Okay, so that's a good question, because it's one of those words that we say a lot and people can kind of mean different things. I think a lot of times people use legacy in kind of a marketing and money sense. And there's certainly a charitable aspect that you can bring into your legacy of giving money to charities that mean something to you to help perpetuate meaningful things to you. But there's such a broader way to view your legacy. And sometimes, usually, things that aren't quantifiable, they don't have funds attached to them, are really the important aspects of your legacy. I joke that one of the important things that I inherited from my dad was the Minnesota Vikings, which some people might consider a family curse. Sometimes I wonder. But that's a huge legacy in my family, is just diehard sports fandom. And that's, in my case, because my kids don't know my dad, but that's something that I'm passing on from my dad to them. There are pieces of our legacy, foods that we make, and for a lot of families, language. In my family, German language. We're German Americans, and we speak German. We try to get our kids to speak German. Those are all aspects of your legacy that are so much more important than the money that you're going to leave, because the money, it can be nice, it can bless people, it can sometimes be the opposite on people, but it's just a thing. But these aspects of your personalities and the things that are important to you, that's what people are really going to remember you for.
I love that. So I'm just going to kind of repeat back some of the stuff you said, because it's super important there. You started out talking about Yes, a legacy can be financial. So things like charitable giving, where you're passing on some things that you're passionate about and you want to help them financially. But it can be the things that are non-quantifiable, where there's not a dollar sign attached to it. You lit up when you mentioned that your dad had left the love of the Minnesota Vikings to you, and the
Yep.
love of sports. And
Yeah.
so you don't see a lot of people light up when they're talking about those old stock certificates that are in the attic.
Right.
So there is
Wow,
an
that life insurance policy.
yeah. So there's an argument to be made that these might be some of the most important things to pass on. You talked about the tradition, the language, the traditions, the things that are important in that family that you can pass on. So I love that. And then your website and Organized Afterlife, you've got more content like this. We've got just about 5 minutes left in this show.
Hmm.
What have I forgot to ask you that you want to
Oh
share with
gosh.
the listeners?
Oh man, I think we covered my favorite things to talk about. So uh, I think just going back to that initial thought of um, talking about the fact that you're mortal. We all are. You're not acknowledging a personal weakness by saying that. Um, Planning for the fact that you will pass away. Um, our culture is really terrible. We really dysfunctional around this topic. It really is one of our last taboos. Um, but it's so important, and our culture tells us that it's morbid to do your will, to think about the fact that you're going to die. Um, but really, it makes you wise, and it makes you make good choices, and set things up to bless people down the road as opposed to be a burden on people.
I love it. I love it. I couldn't have said it better myself. Jennifer, thank you so much for sharing this information with us and taking the time to educate people about their estate planning. Have a great weekend there.
You too.
And you have been listening to KPFT Houston.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of Money Matters Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, visit us on the web at www.moneymatterspodcast.com. Drop us a line on SpeakPipe on the right-hand corner. It will receive any voicemails, questions, thoughts, concerns that you have about the show. In addition to this, we recently launched a Patreon campaign. Click on the Donate Now tab to hit the tip jar and find out what Patreon's campaign is all about.